House Republicans are demanding the Department of Justice hand over transcripts and recordings of President Biden's interviews with special counsel Robert Hur after his report called into question the president's mental fitness. The special counsel's nearly 400-page report released last week painted the president as, quote, an elderly man with a poor memory. But it also revealed Biden's mishandling of classified documents did not warrant criminal charges. One of the Republicans calling for the release of the report is Representative Gary Palmer. He took to social media and the platform X, writing, if the White House believes Hur's characterization of Biden's cognitive state is false, why are they blocking the release of the recordings and the transcript from Biden's deposition? Representative Palmer is with us now. He's also the chairman of the House Republican Policy Committee. Congressman, thank you for your time on this. There are some who argue it doesn't matter what's found, that the point is to keep the concerns about Biden's age in the headlines. Is that the goal?
Not really. I think it's a very serious allegation made by the investigators in their report that cognitively he's not capable of sitting before a jury. And that raises serious questions about whether or not he is cognitively able to manage the affairs of the nation. And that should be of concern to everyone. There
isn't much of a difference in Trump's age. He's not a whole lot younger. It has some
Marni,
saying that slip-ups.
Age has nothing to do with it.
Age has nothing to do with it?
No. I know people in their 90s who are sharp as a tack. So I think it is a serious misrepresentation to say that it's age related. I don't know what his problems are, whether he has other elements that he's dealing with, but this is not an issue of how old he is. It's whether or not he has the cognitive ability to carry out the duties that he's sworn to carry out.
All right, so if you say age is not a factor, there is pressure for special counsel Hur to testify. What specifically would you ask him about this testimony?
Well, I would want to hear the tapes myself. I think that the American public has a right to know what's in those tapes, how he handled himself in the interviews. I don't think a transcript tells the whole story because you can't hear the inflection in his voice, for instance. So I think the tapes need to be handed over. And I think then the American people will have a better idea of whether or not he's capable of functioning as president of the United States.
There is some talk, Representative, that a redacted copy of the transcript may be offered. How would that be received?
I don't think that is acceptable. If they're concerned about national security issues being in the transcript, and again, I think we need to have the tapes, because you don't get the inflection and the nuances that you get by being able to hear his answers. But we could do that in the skiff. If they're concerned about national security, everyone could convene in the skiff to hear those 5 hours of testimony.
Don't Republicans run the risk, Congressman, of blowback? Does going after Biden on the issue of national security, not age, as you say, mean opening the door further on Trump's handling of documents in which he faces potential criminal consequences?
Well, we're really not talking about national security here. The investigator said that those were not issues that warranted prosecution. So I don't think that's the issue at all. The issue is whether or not he has
let me stop you there. National security is an issue here. It was part of the reason that the documents were in question. In addition to that, presidential fitness, according to other of your GOP colleagues, and the Justice Department's handling of the investigation, those are the priorities that your GOP colleagues have said they're looking to discuss.
That's not the issue that we're raising. The issue we're raising is whether or not he has the cognitive ability, as I've said repeatedly, to function as president of the United States. The only reason we would need to go in the skiff is that there's information in those recordings from the interview that might compromise national security. But the investigation has concluded that there's nothing that warrants prosecution on the national security side of things. The whole issue here is whether or not he has the cognitive ability to function as president.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.